Section G, Eisenhower Republicanism at Home. So we're going to be talking about Eisenhower's domestic policy, meaning the policy right here in the United States as opposed to foreign policy. So Eisenhower's domestic policy, and of course it's going to be a Republican policy because of course he's a Republican. So Republican ideas like a smaller federal government, less spending, kind of anti-immigration, all of these things will be kind of wrapped together in Eisenhower's domestic policy, which in fact is called dynamic conservatism. Okay, so dynamic meaning like kind of a broad range. Thinking of dynamics in singing or in music, the idea is that it can be really low, really soft, to really loud, right? So dynamic means it's there's a lot of range to it. So dynamic meaning that when it comes to people, he's going to be liberal, but when it comes to things like government and economics, he's going to be very conservative. All right. You remember Eisenhower, though, he does not want to cause waves. So he is going to more or less, as much as he can, ignore the issue of civil rights. So during his domestic policy, he kind of pushes civil rights to the side, but really focuses on things like balancing the budget, guarding against what he calls creeping socialism. A lot of those New Deal programs are still around, so we'll see him kind of nixing some of those New Deal programs. So what he does is he kind of just puts a brake on Truman's military spending, and also he curbs the power of the TVA, right, the Tennessee Valley Authority. So that's a New Deal program that's being nixed. And also we see that he gives control of overseas oil fields back to the states, so smaller national government. So when it comes to immigration, we see that the Mexican government was really worried that a lot of their citizens, or a lot of Mexicans, were illegally migrating to the United States through the Bracero program that we learned about from World War II. So what we have during Eisenhower's first term is something called Operation Wetback. And what this was, it was a massive roundup of illegal immigrants in the United States. So in 1954, about 1 million illegal immigrants were sent back to Mexico. Right, it's called Operation Wetbacks because a lot of these immigrants, to get to the United States in the first place, had to cross through the Rio Grande River, getting their backs wet. So we see a roundup of illegal immigrants during his administration. And also we see the policy with regards to Native Americans change again. If you recall back to the New Deal program, we had the New Deal for Indians, or for Native Americans. And this was the idea is that the New Deal for Indians was we wanted them to embrace their heritage. We gave them some more rights when it came to self-government, that sort of thing. Well, Eisenhower is going to flip that on its head, right? So now Eisenhower wants to revert back to the Dawes Surveillance Act when we wanted assimilation. So now Eisenhower is going to say, no, we want assimilation right again, just like that Dawes Act had before the Indian New Deal. So Eisenhower for assimilation when it comes to Native Americans. But still, you know, we see him nixing a lot of these New Deal programs, the Dawes, I can't ever say that word right, Surveillance Act, and also the TVA. Those are nixed, but he does embrace some New Deal programs, like unemployment insurance, like Social Security. He actually expands that during his reign/administration. But really, surprisingly, he does go above and beyond even the New Dealers when it comes to one thing, and that is the Federal Highway Act of 1956. This is a huge works project, federal works project, federal money being spent on kind of building infrastructure. So the Federal Highway Act of 1956 spent $27 billion, with a B, $billion to build 42,000 miles of interstates. And really the motive here was military. we're in the Cold War, and his thought was, what if Russia invades? We're going to need a really good system of transportation across the United States. So really, in Eisenhower's mind, this is a way to help protect the United States in case of Russian invasion. We'll have some good, an easy way to mobilize troops. And this, of course, creates thousands of jobs, helps speed along that suburbanization process. But, you know, we also see this is taking a lot of business away from the railroads, right? We'll see truckers replace a lot of the railroad traffic. And also there will become problems of, you know, pollution and an increase of energy use. Hashtag fuel, right? Okay, section H, a new look in foreign policy. So this is the foreign policy of Eisenhower. Before we had seen his domestic policy being dynamic conservatism. Now the foreign policy is called the new look. And really when it comes to Eisenhower and foreign policy, there's just one name you need to remember, and that is his Secretary of State. Eisenhower's Secretary of State for both of his terms is the one and only John Foster Dulles. And the new look policy is more or less saying that containment was stupid. Containment didn't go far enough. We're looking at Korea, and that was just a mess. We had spent so much money and so many lives on this war, and you know, Eisenhower's thinking that was not the way to go. Okay. Let me get here. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to even go further, not just to contain communism, but actually roll it back, get rid of it in some areas, while at the same time spending less money. And it may be confusing to you because you're like, how are you going to spend less money but at the same time get a bigger result? Well, here was their plan, this new look. What they wanted to do was to kind of put the Army and the Navy in the back seat and really boost the Air Force, the super bombers like the Strategic Air Command, these super bombers with nuclear capabilities. So the idea is we'd say to China, we'd say the Soviet Union, hey, communist nations of the world, you need to stay in line, because as soon as you step out of line, we're going to threaten you with a massive retaliation, right? The use of nuclear weapons. So that was our plan. Don't use troops on the ground, but just threaten nuclear force to make sure that they stay in line. The policy of boldness, as it's called. Kind of more bang for your buck. All right, so just so you know, at this time in 1953, this is when Stalin dies, right? The leader of the Soviet Union dies, Stalin, and we see a new leader, Khrushchev. So Khrushchev, is in power now, just so you know. So our new bold policy here, the new look, the idea that we're threatening nuclear warfare to keep the Soviet Union in line, that theory is tested when Hungary, the country of Hungary, the people in Hungary has this uprising against the Soviet Union. So the people of Hungary want their independence from the Soviet Union. So there's this big uprising. The people of Hungary, assuming the United States would totally help them out to overthrow the Soviet Union. However, our bluff is kind of called, right, during this crisis, because we actually kind of turn a deaf ear to the cries of this Hungarian uprising. Eisenhower realizes that this crisis is kind of too minor to use nuclear weapons on. So, our bluff is called, right? Our bark is worse than our bite, because we ignore the Hungarian uprising, because we don't threaten, we don't actually take out the nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union just goes in and cruelly crushes the Hungarian uprising. So much for that, new look, so much for that threatening the nuclear warfare. Anyway, section I, the Vietnam nightmare. So we're definitely going to talk about Vietnam later on, but this is kind of the roots of what will become the Vietnam quote-unquote war. So this is the roots. So Europe in general was doing okay in the 50s, right? We had NATO kind of forming those alliances, that friendship. We had the Marshall Plan really helping to rebuild Europe. However, Southeast Asia was definitely a different story. Southeast Asia, kind of Indochina, whatever you want to call it. It was a hot mess. Many of those areas were colonies of European countries. For example, Vietnam was a colony still of the French. And there was a group, a nationalist group in Vietnam who had been trying to get independence from the French for a very long time. Specifically, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of this nationalist group, had been trying since World War I to get Vietnam's independence from the French. So Ho Chi Minh and his nationalist supporters are called the Viet Minh. Okay, so what happens is the Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh starts making efforts to actually gain their independence from the French, starts using violence to kick out the French. And typically the United States might be a fan of Ho Chi Minh. After all, we're all about self-determination, letting nationalities have their own country. However, our problem was Ho Chi Minh was communist. So instead of supporting the nationalist Vietnam, we actually support France financially to the tune of about $1 billion a year. We're giving France all of this money to fight against the communist Ho Chi Minh and his nationalist group, the Viet Minh. All right. But the thing was, the French, although we were giving them a lot of money, they just weren't doing well. There was a lot of guerrilla warfare. Just the French weren't winning, to say the least. And kind of this final battle is the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So Dien Bien Phu. And this is a huge loss and a very embarrassing loss to the French. While we did supply the French with money, Eisenhower kind of drew the line. We didn't send any troops to help the French, who were definitely losing this Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Okay. So as a result, after the French lose this battle, we divide Vietnam in two, right? The North communist, the South is kind of more pro-British. And once again, it's going to be divided along a line of latitude, this time the 17th parallel. So this looks a lot like Korea, right? So we're dividing the country in two. All right. So the deal was Ho Chi Minh agreed to this division of Vietnam, because he was promised that in 2 years' time they would hold an election throughout both North and South Vietnam, which would allow the country to unify if it so chose to do so. Okay, so Ho Chi Minh was expecting in 2 years to unify Vietnam under his leadership, because he expected the Vietnamese people would want that. The deal was, after 2 years, when there were supposed to be elections, the United States, realizing that Ho Chi Minh definitely would have won, decided to not hold the elections. So Vietnam is kind of a ticking time bomb. North, Ho Chi Minh and communism, and the South, kind of a puppet government of the West, their leader being Diem, kind of just a puppet of the West. All right, more on that later. Section J, Cold War crises in Europe and the Middle East. So kind of more flares up of the Cold War we'll see in the 50s. Okay, so the U.S. did support the French in Indochina. We just talked about, we gave them billions of dollars to help them out in Indochina. So in return, the United States got to rearm Western Germany. Remember, Germany is more or less divided in two. The East is with the Soviet Union, the West is with the United States, or with the Western powers. So, of course, France is never a fan of Germany rearming, because France had been invaded by Germany in World War I and in World War II. Don't even talk about the Franco-Prussian War. We won't go there. Anyway, so France has never been a fan of Germany being rearmed, but because we helped them out with this thing in Indochina, they did agree to have the western part, or the United States-controlled part of Germany, rearm. So we'll see in 1955, the West Germany will actually become a part of NATO. All right, so now that Western Germany is a part of NATO, the Eastern European countries signed something called the Warsaw Pact as kind of a counterweight to NATO. So kind of the Soviet NATO is called the Warsaw Pact. But after that sign, really we have a time of thawing quote unquote, in the Cold War, a time of hope for a peaceful world. And what happens is Khrushchev decides to meet with the Western powers in Geneva, Switzerland. And this is called the Geneva Conference. Okay, so there at Geneva, the Soviets agree to end their occupation of Austria, which they've been occupying since before World War II. And Khrushchev also denounces the bloody excess of Stalin. So Stalin died in '53. So they're saying, Khrushchev's saying, yeah, Stalin probably did step out of line. So there was a lot of hope that the Cold War would, kind of go away after this. The spirit of Geneva, the spirit of cooperation. However, after the Soviets do crush that Hungarian uprising we talked about just a little bit ago, that spirit of Geneva is also crushed with the Hungarians' hope for independence. Anyway, and also we'll see, some very, very strong tensions forming when the Soviet Union starts to kind of look over their shoulder at the Arab oil nations in the Middle East. So what happened was the United States, France, Britain, a lot of Western companies had control over the oil in the Middle East. Yes, the oil was in Iran, the oil was in Kuwait. However, it was the companies from the West that were actually making the money because they were actually pumping the oil, they were selling it. So the Soviet Union, quote unquote, whispers in the ear of Iran that Iran should start to kind of rebel against these companies. Iran should take over these companies. Iran should get the money. So the Soviet Union's kind of egging on Iran to start resisting control of these Western companies. Well, the United States, we like our cars, we like oil, so we were not a huge fan of this president of Iran cooperating with the Soviet Union. So America, of course being America, we send in our CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and we throw out the president of Iran who had been kind of cooperating with the Soviet Union. So we have a coup, that guy's gone, and we put in his place kind of a pro-American the Shah of Iran. So we throw out Iran's, president, leader, and we put in our own. The people of Iran will resent this in about 20 years. This is going to come back to bite us in the butt, but we're not there yet. Okay. Yes. Also, this section ends by talking about the Suez Crisis. This is also in the Middle East. So this is a long story, but it's very exciting. So just hold yourself, brace yourself. Okay, Egypt. The president of Egypt, his name is Nasser. He wanted to build a dam on the Nile River. One, to help control flooding, and two, for electricity, for some money, that sort of thing. The problem was he didn't have money to build the dam. So the United States and Britain offer some financial support for this dam to be built in Egypt. President Nasser's happy about it. Things are going good. However, President Nasser, quote unquote, starts to flirt with communism. So the United States and Britain saying, oh no you didn't, withdraw our financial support for this dam. So President Nasser's like, well, I'm going to get this dam one way or the other. So what President Nasser does is he nationalizes the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is the canal that connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. Google it, right? So what happens is that's a very extremely important canal when it comes to shipping oil from the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, to the Western world. So now that President Nasser has nationalized it, he's controlling it for one thing, but also really it had been American, French, and British stockholders that actually owned most of the canal, most of the stock of the canal. So we're losing out two ways, right? We're losing control of the canal, but we're also losing a lot of money that had been invested in the canal. All right, so what are we going to do about it? Well, the United States was not involved in this at all. It was actually France, Britain, and Israel. What they do in retaliation for Nasser nationalizing this canal is they start to attack Egypt. And in their mind, they assume the United States is on the same side, right? The United States is losing out when Nasser takes over this canal after all. However, the United States actually condemns Britain and France as the aggressors. The United States saying, no, you shouldn't be attacking Egypt, whatever. So, because the United States is condemning France and Britain, we do not supply them with the oil they need for this attack. Because they don't have any oil, they don't have any fuel for the attack ends. They go away, they withdraw. And then the UN sends in some peacekeepers to kind of stabilize this. But that's the Suez Crisis also happening, foreign policy during Eisenhower's term. And something just to keep in mind is, to me at least, it always seems like the Middle East hasn't been in control of the oil supply, but that wasn't true. Even in 1940, right, even before the end of World War II, about 2/3 of the world's oil was actually drilled from the United States. But we see in the 50s and the 60s, that's going to change. We're going to see a greater dependence on the oil in the Middle East. So we see these Middle Eastern countries becoming more and more important. And so what Eisenhower does, because we realize how important it is for the US and for the NATO nations to have control over the oil fields, he puts forth something called the Eisenhower Doctrine, much like the Truman Doctrine, but for the Middle East. So the Eisenhower Doctrine is saying, or pledges U.S. military support and economic aid to Middle Eastern countries threatened by communist aggressors. So we want to make sure those communists, like the Soviet Union, keep their paws off the Middle East. So this is kind of a threat by the United States, the Eisenhower Doctrine. You stay away from our oil fields. Okay, but we're scared about communism. The communists are going to take over the Middle East. But really what we ought to be concerned about is nationalism. Not that other countries are going to come in and take over the oil fields, but nationalism is the concern, the rightful concern, that the countries themselves, Iran, Kuwait, all these countries are going to kind of kick out the U.S. and kind of these Western companies from their own borders, kind of taking control, taking back their countries. That's the actual concern we're going to need to deal with. So what happens is exactly that. Nationalism rises up. We see OPEC formed. OPEC, acronym standing for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This is signed in 1960. It expands, but starts with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, even Venezuela, not in the Middle East, in case you're wondering. Anyway, these countries kind of get together, form OPEC, and become extremely powerful, kind of put a tight stranglehold on the Western economies, because they now control how much oil is being drilled. And because they control the supply, they also control the price at which they can sell their oil. So definitely kind of like a cartel, right? So OPEC is forming at this time. So we really had to be concerned about nationalism, not so much communism in the Middle East. All right, one more for this video, section K, round 2 for Ike. Ike meaning Eisenhower, of course. So this is the 1956 elections, and all I'm going to say about the 1956 elections is it looks almost exactly like the 1952 elections when Eisenhower won the first time. In fact, it'll be the same match-off. It'll be Republicans nominating Eisenhower and the Democrats nominating Stevenson. And of course this was, although we're talking about all these crises and stuff in the United States and the domestic policy, right, it still was mostly a time of prosperity and general peace, give or take some civil rights movements. And even, so we see Eisenhower kind of easily winning. Why fix something that's not broken? So he gets 457 to Stevenson's 73. And even Louisiana, which is in the South, this is the first time that state actually goes Republican since before the Civil War. So the South is usually Democratic, but even Louisiana voted for Eisenhower. He was doing a good job. People loved him, right? However, the Democrats did control Congress. So the Republicans win the White House, but the Democrats actually win control over Congress, which is actually a very rare thing back in the day. At first, Eisenhower, especially during his first term, he was really criticized as being a part-time president. They thought he perhaps golfed a little too much, kind of took a back seat, sort of speaking. But you know, after he's nominated the second time around, after his second term, he really starts to pick up his game, golfing a little less, governing a little more. And one of the issues he really tackles is the labor unions, because the labor unions were getting very gangster, to say the least. So what happens is there's a lot of reports of corruption coming forth from the unions, especially because in 1955 we have the AFL, which is the main union for the skilled laborers, teaming up with Teamsters, the CIO, which is the unskilled laborers. So once those two kind of merge together, we see a lot of corruption kind of forming out of the labor unions. Actually, a lot of connection with kind of the mafia, actually. For example, they have a lot of bad leaders. Probably the most known is Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. He served 5 of those years, and then his sentence was commuted or lessened by President Nixon. So he was supposed to serve 13 years, got out after 5 years. However, soon after, he disappeared. And a lot of people assume, we never found his body, but a lot of people assume that one of his deals must have gone bad and he was murdered. So Jimmy Hoffa is just kind of very much an example of the corruption in the labor unions during Eisenhower's tenure, especially after 1955, the AFL and the CIO combined. Okay, so Eisenhower, to counter this corruption, got Congress to pass something called the Landrum Griffin Act of 1959. Sounds exciting, I know. So let's figure out what this Landrum Griffin Act was. So what it does is expanded some anti-labor statutes that were from the Taft-Hartley Act, which was, of course, a knife to the heart of the labor unions. So even more restrictions on the labor unions. Made them more financially accountable, made them accountable for some kind of like bullying tactics they were using as well. So trying to straighten out those labor unions. Okay. Also during Eisenhower's round 2 or second term, we see the Soviets really making a lot of advances in science, which is not good for us because we want to be the best, right? So we see that on October 4th of 1957, the Soviet scientists lofted into orbit the first man-made satellite that would orbit around the world, and that was Sputnik. Okay, Sputnik was only 184 pounds. However, a month later, Sputnik 2 was launched, and that was 1,120 pounds. So the fact that they have enough math and science know-how to launch a man-made satellite, very impressive. Of course, this freaked out the United States, because the United States, you know, always thought we were superior scientifically. So now we started to worry about the fact intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay, what are those? They're abbreviated ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So what this is really, these are missiles that contain nuclear weapons. So before, you know, like during the end of World War II, we had an airplane drop a bomb on Japan. Well, these are missiles, so they had the range of up to 3,500 miles. So you launch it like here, it launches off kind of like a rocket going to space, and then kind of curves over to hit its target. So they're guided missiles that have nuclear capabilities. And 3,500 miles, that's a pretty big range. That could definitely cross the Pacific Ocean if need be. So this is a new weapon of terror that is formed. So because of these ICBMs and because of Sputnik, or the fear of ICBMs and because of Sputnik, really rocket fever hits the United States. We need to get our act together. So what happens is Eisenhower, this is when he creates NASA, right, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, giving billions of dollars pouring into NASA to develop better missiles. It was kind of a rough go we had this big missile, the Vanguard missile, that blew up on TV about a couple feet after it launched, a couple feet off the ground, so that was kind of embarrassing. We finally, in 1958, got our own satellite into orbit, but this was only about 2.5 pounds, about the size of a grapefruit. So we were trying, but by 1960 we did have our act together. By 1960, the United States did have intercontinental ballistic missiles under our belt. So we had a rough start, but we quickly did quote unquote catch up to where we thought the Russians were. Okay, and also Sputnik, remember that's the first satellite Russians launched into space. It really revolutionizes the American educational system. So some people thought that the education system in America was too easygoing, so we really increased the study of math, increased the study of science. The federal government gives $87 million in loans to college students and grants to schools to increase the teaching of science and language, and also the National Defense and Education Act is passed, once again kind of promoting education. We can't get behind the Russians. All right, with that, we are done with this section.